Hey guys, this is Devsigners and Unicorns. It's about work, satisfaction, burnout, and hero culture. I'm Chris Strahl, the CEO of BASALT. BASALT is a digital agency focused on front-end development and design systems. So we do a whole lot of stuff associated with building these architectures that use systems for managing user experiences. So component libraries, design systems, all those sorts of things kind of like fall into that category. So that puts us in the front-end development space. We do a ton of work with Drupal. We also do work with other CMS platforms. And then there's kind of another part to the business that's around more the design side of things and some of the management consulting, sort of change management and organizational behavior type stuff. I'm Chris. You can find me at Chris Strahl pretty much everywhere. So first, a little bit about Devsigners. These people are really chimeras in that there's kind of this notion of if someone's a Devsigner, they probably started out as a designer first. And they were probably in the UX space or working in design, and then somebody realized that like they could actually build HTML prototypes and co-opted them into a front-end development role or front-end development team. Oftentimes these people translate what designers actually mean to development teams. Basically, the way that organizations tend to look at talent for these people is they get drawn very heavily into this developer mindset with this eye towards this design idea. Lots of these people have the soul of a designer, and that they like that creative expertise. They look at that creativity as a big part of who they are and how they represent themselves inside of a workplace. But oftentimes they struggle to find fit there. So people often feel like they don't get to exercise those creative muscles, or they don't get to actually spend time really doing design anymore because there's so much focus on the actual production of code and production of development. Also, these people end up continually explaining things to other people. Like, this is what this designer probably intended by this particular comp, or this is what this developer means when he or she says that is very difficult to implement. And so oftentimes this person works as a communications medium between the two different worlds. Then there's unicorns. And so unicorns are magical creatures. Everybody has probably worked with people like this inside of organizations before, where literally they're the first person you ask when you have a technical question. Every single Slack ping hits them first, every email query, every walking by their desk being like, hey, how about this one thing? Oftentimes people that are of this particular type architected the systems, or they were the first people to lay down the foundational code or the first pieces of an architecture. And in that case, they're deeply ingrained in all the systems. They're the one person that knows how everything works, or maybe one of a handful of people that know how everything works. And they're really, really hard to find, these kind of people that are able to understand all the parts of the system and contribute meaningfully to them. And they're even harder to keep. So what happens is organizations tend to be really fearful of these people in a certain way, and that like if they go out the door, so much knowledge leaves with them that organizations have this tendency to build unicorn groves, where there's this like special place that this person resides in that's apart from everybody else, that has all of the creature comforts attached to what they might want or desire, but ultimately doesn't necessarily represent a sense of happiness for that person. We'll get into that in just a minute. So both types of these people are really powerful in that they're force multipliers. Their effect on the organization goes far beyond them. And it wouldn't be a DrupalCon presentation without something about Star Wars in it, so there's various Star Wars references throughout this. So these people are held up as heroes, right? Like, there's so much reliant upon somebody that can actually like talk to designers and developers in the same room at the same time. There's so much reliant on that one person that understands deeply what the design or what the development choices were made in the early parts of a project and how those impact things today. And so organizations really want to hold on to them, but this creates this sense of hero culture. So valuable people, while they're very hard to find, they often also take a disproportionate focus from a business. It cultivates this feedback of addiction, right? You have these people that are these standouts inside of your organization, and that's addictive. You have a feedback loop of recognition and being special, and that in and of itself is exclusive. It also hides real problems. If you rely really heavily on these people to solve all of the engineering and design challenges or the architectural challenges of the organization, that doesn't really scale. And it becomes very reactive as a mindset instead of intentional. How are we reacting to this particular problem set, or how are we thinking about this particular design decision based upon how are we thinking about the future of our digital product? And then it also has this rather vicious cycle of dependency. So you, as a hero inside an organization, unintentionally likely end up perpetuating a culture of hero worship because you're the person that's always pulling everything out of the fire, or you're the person that's the only person that can do this particular thing. And as such, you end up in these key roles that are very hard to work your way out of. And that is a big problem in that you create this dependency around yourself that is very hard to break. It has a very, very dark side to hero culture, and that you end up inevitably creating stressful situations through a tremendous amount of work. It's very often leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, and that it's very rare that someone joins an organization to go fight fires. Job security absolutely is not a substitute for satisfaction. You'll hear people say this all the time. They're like, well, hey, at least everybody needs me. And there's a lot of this sense of work based on an obligation to an organization instead of actually doing the things that someone really cares about. And that oftentimes leads to this like erosion of self inside of a company. Real progress on a product or a goal becomes a byproduct instead of an intention. And then you end up having self-worth that must be derived by innately fixing things, not necessarily doing the things you want to innovate on. So in the case of designers, this is probably the most prevalent, where you end up spending a lot of time just writing front-end code and you don't ever really touch design anymore, except in design review meetings or something like that. Or in a unicorn instance, I always wanted to experiment with like GraphQL or something like that, and I've never actually gotten to do any of that because I keep having to handle 30 Slack pings a day that ask me about all of these other like features that I built years ago, and then I have to go look up what all of that was all about at that time. And so this dependency creates a massive problems. And so the net effect of all of these things is it drifts people towards being generalists. Most of the time in organizations, the power of its most valuable people come from their depth, not from their breadth. And inevitably, when you create dependency on people, that dependency only really scales horizontally. And so you end up being lightly involved in dozens of things instead of deeply involved in a few things where you could potentially make the most impact. As probably all of you are aware, especially in the web, if you're not learning new things all the time, you have a tendency to fall behind. And when you're a generalist, it becomes very difficult to just know all the new things you need to know about your job. And this also impacts and creates more stress based on more workload to stay on top of all the things you need to stay on top of. And ultimately, these people don't last. You feed imposter syndrome with hero culture, where somebody is always asking themselves, hey, when is the other shoe going to drop? When is somebody going to realize that I'm not really all that I'm cracked up to be inside of this organization? Or you spend time solving other people's problems so you can check a bunch of items off of your sprint backlog or your to-do list instead of really tackling the deeper problems that matter. So that art of busy idea of, hey, I'm really busy and I'm going to ignore all of these big important problems to focus on being able to check off as many things on my to-do list as I can. And mastery becomes really secondary. It gets back to what I was saying earlier about how you start to lose your innovation edge when you get pushed into this model. So how do you fight it? This is probably my favorite comic to describe hero culture inside of organizations, where you sit there and you say, all right, line up all the things I have to do in order of importance, and there's this giant, big, hairy thing like right up front in the line, and you're like, actually, just line up in terms of like the number of things I can get done today. So then it becomes really easy to go check a bunch of things off your to-do list without ever actually handling the most important thing. So you have to work on this from a cultural level as an organization. You have to have better processes, better rewards, and better technology. We're going to dive into that in just a second. And then there's also an individual component to this that is about empathy, self-determination, and success. So looking at that culture change, processes are really important here, and these come from inside of organizations. Probably the number one thing to emphasize here is when you add something to somebody's plate, you have to assume that that plate is full. Something else must go away. You can do this if you're an agency with things like booking systems, where you say like, hey, if I'm adding 10 hours of time for this person to do a thing, 10 hours needs to come out of some other thing. Inside of more product-driven organizations, think about it in terms of sprint points or sprint planning, where you say like, hey, if I'm adding more to this person's plate, yes, they can do it, but the reality is something else should come off with that addition. Have some time associated with mentorship and coaching also. I really recommend taking your best people and not making them fully busy actually doing the work. Give them adequate time to go lead and to mentor other people inside of your organization. And then build a successful model for that and use it for nearly everything. So this includes building products. It includes building internal initiatives or internal programs, like onboarding, training, pair programming initiatives, documentation. All of those things, treat them as work that is assigned in the same way every time. It's also really important that you track the risks associated with hero culture too. So if you see somebody that is a real standout person, you want to embrace that ability in them, but you also want to track the risks associated with potentially pushing that too far. Another big thing that helps kind of mitigate a lot of these problems is have really great information sharing. One of the biggest things that perpetuates hero culture is that idea that like only this person can do a thing. Well, that's largely mitigated by that person's ability to share information with other people. And so build a knowledge management system, use that knowledge management system, and set time aside for that person to show other people how to do things, so they can gain the knowledge that they need in order to be able to fill that role when it's necessary. And then what gets measured gets improved, so look at metrics associated with all of this stuff, and try to build that into a review process, into a sprint retro, into any number of other ways that you can periodically look at how people are spending their time and make sure that it's going down the right road. Reward systems are really interesting. I spent a ton of time studying these in college. But one of the things that has always stuck with me is a bad reward system is far worse than no reward system at all. There's a lot of cases in organizations where reward systems that are paved with really good intentions end up really, really having a negative impact on a team or on a group of people. These are really, really hard to get right, and they differ dramatically in terms of how the situations work. So they're often informal, so most of the time people have a reward system, they just haven't formalized it, whether that's like a karma bot in a Slack channel, or just a like, hey, like have lunch with your boss once a week if you're killing it on a project. Like all of these things count as reward systems, even if they're not formalized. And you have to think about them in terms of the context of what you're doing for somebody, right? A famous example is Employee of the Month, right? So you all remember like the shopping centers you all used to go to as kids, where there'd always be like that parking space reserved for the Employee of the Month or whatever. That is a proven awful reward system. And the reason why is it's a zero-sum game. One person's Employee of the Month means that all of the other people are not. And it has actually a net negative morale drag on an organization. And so those types of reward systems that emphasize the performance of a single person or a single team above the performance of other teams are not collectively good reward systems for organizations. So think about things in terms of team rewards. Think about ways that you can build rewards that aren't trivial but also don't nurture dependency. Financial rewards are a really great example of this, right? Like throwing somebody a $25 Amazon gift card is not going to make anybody richer or poorer, but giving them a $1,000 Christmas bonus, people come to rely on that idea. The Christmas bonus has also fallen out of fashion because it is a net negative to an organization in a serious way. And so it's really important to look at touting team rewards, but keeping individual rewards personal and private. So if you do want to recognize an individual for their exemplary performance, make sure that you do that privately. Don't make it so that other people feel like they're losing based on this other person gaining. And then make sure you continue to look at how those rewards shape your behavior and call or iterate based on the kinds of things that you're seeing based on those reward systems. We also have better tech now. So one of the things to think about when you're sharing information, and this is predominantly about that, is you want to figure out ways to reduce repetition in people's lives. If you're doing documentation, you want to document something once, both from the standpoint of double entry and also double the maintenance if you're having to do it in multiple places. And you also want to use tools that meet people where they work. Slack is probably the best example of a modern communication tool that meets people where they work. Almost every single developer I work with today ends up in Slack with that app open on their desktop or on their phone almost all day long. And so the more things that you can do inside of Slack that doesn't totally overload Slack is a really great way of continuing to meet people where they're already working. So we do a lot of reviews on this stuff. We've looked at dozens of tools, and we continue at BASALT to challenge each other on which tools are working for us and which tools aren't. And we have really no sacred cows when it comes to them. We spent a ton of time early on setting up a really awesome Jira and Confluence setup, and ultimately nobody was using it. We were having a really hard time getting our documentation up and managed well inside of Confluence. Jira was never really being updated on time, and we were really struggling with adoption associated with it. And we killed it and went towards Notion, which was a major decision point for us as an agency. And now Notion is used by almost every single person in the company almost every single day. And that tool just happened to work better for us as an agency. We continue to iterate on this stuff. Stand-Uply is our newest foray into Slack tooling, which is basically an automated way of nagging people about stand-ups or lunch orders. And we're still evaluating whether or not that's going to make the cut, but ultimately we're evaluating tools and revising this stuff all the time to try to better meet people's workloads. Focusing on the people. So building empathy is a big part of this whole thing, right? You need to change your idea of what a positive contribution means if you're having a problem with hero culture. There's a lot of traps here. This isn't just a 9-to-5. It's something that I know I've told people before. The reality is that people should want to give their time to an organization, and they should want to spend whatever extra time that they feel like they need to spend doing their job. Obviously, there's still expectation setting that takes place on working hours and work time and everything like that. But don't use that as a way of essentially trapping somebody into a workload that they're not prepared for or they're not willing to meet. If somebody's not able to make their contribution happen on a team, it's usually because of other factors. It's rarely because they're not working hard enough. The family thing, this is a really common thing, especially in agency, is everybody thinks about working together as a family. The reality is a family is something that you love unconditionally. Work should be very conditional about your happiness and your satisfaction there in order to continue to want to work at a place. You're the only one that can get this done is another horrible thing to say to somebody, and that traps them into always being the one responsible for that thing. And a better way of looking at that is like, hey, you're the only one that can do this right now. Can you please train somebody else or show somebody else how to do this thing? And then the last one is the great influencer quote of you'll get great exposure and experience. Exposure and experience is not a substitute for real compensation, nor is it a substitute for satisfaction. My favorite quote ever is don't you want to make some text files you'll pass on to your children? That's the absurdity of kind of like what we do in the web is none of us are building homes or any of these structures that are really going to last, right? Like most of the code that we produce as people in this world is fairly ephemeral. Like it's going away in a few years. This is not something that is like building this bulk of inheritance that goes down throughout the ages. And so be thinking about the fact that like we're working in this really ephemeral place of the web, and be conscious of what that means to people, right? Very few people are actually in this job because they have this notion of like creation beyond a few years out. And it's very important to recognize that as a limiting factor to how hard you want to drive somebody to do something. So the other part of this is mentorship. So make sure that you allow time for mentorship and have a program focused on that mentorship, and make business cases for exploration and learning. So I want so-and-so to be able to learn more about React. How do I actually put a project in front of that person that allows them to get that done gives them ample time to do it, and also allows them to share that knowledge with other people. We do this through internal initiatives. So we have a person at BASALT that is dedicated to receiving in ideas for things that people want to do, formalizing a sort of mini project structure attached to it, and then running them through that project. And it gets booked the same way that all of our time for all of our clients gets booked. So it goes into the same system for managing that internal project and that internal knowledge and learning that that person wants in the same way that our client work does. The other thing that you need to think about if you're a product company and not an agency is how does that mentorship time ultimately affect the development cost of your product? It's oftentimes this invisible thing that you end up paying anyway, and so it's better to recognize it up front as, hey, we need to have better skills in a particular area in order to complete this project successfully. Like, say you're building an app with React and Redux, and everybody has like rudimentary understanding of React. You probably need to spend a lot of time training those people to be better at the more difficult, complex sides of actually building an app in React in order for them to be successful at the ultimate project. And then self-determination. My favorite video game up there. So keep your curiosity and spend at least some time on exploration of new ideas. This is a very individual thing. You have to sort of put your own stake in the ground about like, if people are setting aside time for you to go explore and learn new things, have a list of things to go explore and learn that you want to have. It's really kind of awkward when you end up as a manager saying, hey, like, I want you to go learn something new. What do you want to learn? And people are like, oh, gosh, gee, like, there's 17 things, and all of them are based upon my immediate experience, but those might not be the things that actually, like, give you joy in the long term. Find places where you have autonomy and personalize them so that you own them your own way. This can be as simple as like changing your email background or your Slack colors or any number of things that allow you to have your own personal touches attached to work. Lots of studies have been done about the personalization of stuff on the web personalization of stuff in physical space, like having pictures of your family, having a house plant, all these other things contributing positively to work satisfaction. And then look for opportunities every chance you get to collaborate and share knowledge with your team. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to kind of rush through a little bit of this stuff. Another part of this, and the biggest thing here, is to understand as a person, you have a lot of self-determination in how you work. Keep and encourage others to keep a reasonable pace. If you're working 60 hours a week and that feels good for you, that's fine, but also make sure that the pace of that work that you're pushing forward doesn't go about impacting other people, that you're not telling everybody else on your team to work 60 hours with you. If working 40 is great for you and that's a reasonable pace for your team, that's the type of behavior you want to encourage. You can look at a lot more of this stuff based on tons of research and academic reading. A Hero Behind Every Tree is something that you guys should totally check out. It's a pretty lightweight read. You can pick it up and kill it in an afternoon pretty easily, and it has a lot more depth and exploration of these topics. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, if you want like a college level textbook on how this all works, Group Dynamics for Teams is deep and like hit boot level of slogging through a lot of very technical, researchy laden things. And then there's sort of like in the middle. Smart Leaders, Smart Teams is a great book also that kind of addresses this stuff. So I want to leave just a couple of minutes for questions. Does anybody have anything they want to talk about?
Do you have any advice for on the other end of the hero? I guess I'm thinking of like keeping people that you're mentoring interested. I think I've created so many docs with folks I'm mentoring, and they're like, yeah, I'll get to it, and they never do.
Right.
It's pages and pages of stuff. So.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things that's kind of an organizational structure thing, right? Like you're creating the material, right? So the content is there, the content exists, and now you need people to consume that content. And so the organization supporting that consumption is a good starting point. The other side of it is like you can self-organize a bunch of things like that. You could say like, hey, we're going to spend a lunch on Thursday or whatever, and I want to work with you guys in like a mini workshop to build this app or look at this feature or review this code or talk about the stuff that I've been working on so that you guys understand how to carry it forward. Does that make sense?
Well, I can add something to that based on what we do.
Sure.
I work with him, so, but giving the flexibility to kind of adjust what those tasks might look like. Because oftentimes, if you're mentoring someone, they feel like they need to take whatever advice or ideas that you have and then put those into a big backlog for themselves. And then it gets daunting for them, especially if they're new or specialized. Oftentimes what we do is we have them come up with ideas what they're particularly passionate about learning more about, and then they work on that. But there is a chance that in the next month or something like that, that things change and they're like, this new problem came up that I'm really excited about and I want to pursue. So I think those consistent touch points to give them the flexibility to say, hey, you're just sort of exploring where you're going with this career or what have you, and give them the flexibility to change.
Got probably time for one more, then we gotta
Thank you.
chat.
First.
Anybody else? Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.